Bruce Lee banned video. Nobody in that room believed Bruce Lee would say it to Clint Eastwood's face, but he did. And the 5 words that came back ended everything. It was the spring of 1973. Hollywood was in the middle of a seismic shift. The old studio system had crumbled. A new generation of filmmakers and actors were rewriting the rules of who got to be a star, who got to tell stories, and who got to walk onto a set and demand respect. It was a dangerous, exciting, unpredictable moment in the history of American cinema. Bruce Lee was at the center of that storm. He had just finished filming Enter the Dragon for Warner Brothers, a production that had been grueling, politically complicated, and personally costly. Bruce had fought for every frame of that film. He had negotiated his own terms, choreographed his own fights, and refused to let the studio sand down his edges to make him more palatable to Western audiences. He had been through the machine and come out the other side with his identity intact, which was more than most people could say. He was also exhausted in a way he hadn't yet admitted to himself. On the other side of that moment stood Clint Eastwood, already a myth. The man with no name had walked out of Sergio Leone's Italian desert and into American film history. By 1973, Clint wasn't just an actor. He was a director with a vision, a producer with control, and a professional with a reputation that the entire industry had quietly organized itself around. His sets ran on discipline. His crews ran on respect. His productions ran on time. When the two men were placed in the same orbit through a project that Warner Brothers had been developing quietly for months, people in the industry leaned forward. Two icons, two entirely different philosophies about what filmmaking was, what it owed the audience, and what it demanded of the people making it. Nobody expected the collision to be this direct. Nobody expected it to happen so fast. But within 3 days of production beginning, Bruce Lee had shown up late 3 times. Not slightly late, not traffic delayed late. 3 hours late each day. Each time with a reason that the crew heard through the walls of his trailer before he ever opened the door. And on the 3rd morning, Clint Eastwood got up from his director's chair, crossed the set in front of 80 people, and said 5 words that nobody who was standing there has ever forgotten. This is what actually happened. The thing people forget about Bruce Lee in 1973 is how hard he had already fought just to be in the room. Not metaphorically, literally. He had spent the better part of a decade being told, in boardrooms, in casting offices, and studio hallways, that American audiences weren't ready for an Asian lead, that he was too intense, too specific, too unwilling to soften the sharp edges that made him exactly who he was. He had been passed over for roles he'd helped create. He had watched projects he'd developed get handed to other actors while he was offered the supporting part as a consolation prize. He had taken every one of those rejections and turned them into fuel. By the time Enter the Dragon wrapped, Bruce Lee had done something almost nobody in Hollywood history had managed. He had forced the industry to come to him on his terms, not by playing the game more skillfully than everyone else, by refusing to play it at all until the rules changed. That kind of fight leaves marks, not visible ones, the kind that live behind the eyes and show up in the way a man carries himself into a room. Bruce walked onto every set with the full weight of everything he'd had to overcome to get there. That wasn't arrogance, it was armor. But armor, worn long enough, starts to feel like skin. The project that brought Bruce into Clint's orbit had been in development for nearly 8 months. A serious dramatic production, not a martial arts showcase, not an action vehicle built around choreography. A film that required Bruce to perform in ways that were genuinely new for him. Complex dialogue scenes, sustained emotional vulnerability, long takes with no movement, no physical release, just the actor and the camera and whatever truth he could find between them. Bruce had been excited about it in a way he rarely allowed himself to show. He'd told his wife Linda it was the role that would prove what he'd always known, that he was an actor, not just a phenomenon. He arrived in Los Angeles for the first week of production, carrying that excitement alongside the exhaustion he still hadn't acknowledged. His trainer noticed it first. "You need rest," he told Bruce the night before the first shoot day. "Real rest, not 1 hour, actual sleep." Bruce waved it off. He had a 6 a.m. call time. He'd be fine. He wasn't fine. The crew call was 5:45 a.m., not because anyone enjoyed arriving before sunrise, because the location they were shooting at, a converted warehouse on the east side of Los Angeles that the production designer had transformed into something extraordinary, caught the early morning light through its industrial skylights in a way that lasted exactly 90 minutes. After that, the angle shifted, the quality changed, and the entire visual language the cinematographer had built the scene around simply disappeared. Everyone knew this. It had been in the production notes. It had been discussed at the pre-shoot meeting 3 days earlier. It was the reason the hair and makeup team had been in their chairs at 4:30 a.m., the reason the grips had loaded equipment in the dark, the reason Clint was already on set at 5:30, walking the floor, checking angles, speaking quietly with his director of photography about the morning's first setup. Clint ran his sets the way a good general runs a field operation, not through fear, through clarity. Everyone knew their role, their timing, their responsibility to the person standing next to them. When one part of that system failed, it didn't just affect one person, it affected everyone. At 6 a.m., 80 people were ready. Bruce Lee's trailer was quiet. The first assistant director, a veteran named Ray Carlson who had worked on dozens of productions and had seen most of what the industry could throw at a person, knocked at 6:10. Politely, professionally, the knock of someone who assumed there was a reasonable explanation, no answer. At 6:30 he knocked again. Louder this time. Around him, crew members were checking their watches with the particular stillness of people who are frustrated but too professional to say so out loud. At 7:15, the trailer door opened. Bruce stepped out, squinting against the morning light, moving carefully, like a man whose body was reminding him of every demand he'd made on it over the past several years. He was not in costume. He was not prepared. He looked, in the honest assessment of 3 crew members who later described the moment separately, like someone who had genuinely forgotten where he was for a brief, disorienting second. He recovered quickly, straightened, looked at Ray Carlson with eyes that were sharp again almost immediately. "I need another hour," Bruce said, not apologetically, factually, as if the hour were simply a production requirement he was communicating. Ray Carlson said nothing. He turned and walked back toward Clint's chair. Behind him, the perfect morning light kept moving. Clint heard Ray out without interrupting. That was one of the things his crews respected most about him. He listened completely before he responded. No visible frustration, no immediate reaction, just full attention while the information came in. Then a decision, clean, fast, final. "Move to scene 7, Clint said. "We'll come back to his setup when he's ready." Ray nodded and turned back toward the crew. Within 4 minutes, The entire operation had shifted. Cameras repositioned, lighting adjusted. The two supporting actors who'd been standing ready for Bruce's scene were released temporarily and replaced by the actors needed for Scene 7. The machine reorganized itself around the missing piece and kept moving. That was the thing about Clint's sets. They didn't stop. They adapted. But adaptation had a cost. Scene 7 used different light entirely. Artificial, controlled, independent of the morning window they'd been chasing. It was a good scene. It would be shot well. But it wasn't the scene they'd built the morning around, and everyone on that crew knew it. Bruce emerged at 8:45, nearly 3 hours after his call time. He was focused now, present, moving with the physical precision that made him genuinely remarkable to watch, even when he was simply crossing a room. Whatever fog had been around him that morning had lifted. He was ready to work, and when he worked seriously. Clint said nothing about the delay. He set up the scene, gave Bruce a single quiet note about the emotional intention of the moment, and they shot. Bruce was good. Clint acknowledged it with a nod after the third take, which on his set was the equivalent of a standing ovation. They wrapped for the day 2 hours behind schedule. That evening, the producer pulled Clint aside. His name was David Feller, 20 years in the industry, the kind of man who tracked budget the way a doctor tracked a patient's vitals, constantly, quietly, with calibrated concern. "We lost the morning window," David said. "That scene is going to need a full reschedule. That's money, Clint." "I know what it is," Clint said. "Do we talk to him?" Clint was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the day's shot list, already mentally constructing tomorrow's schedule around the gap today had created. "Not yet," he said finally. "One day doesn't tell you who someone is. 2 days might." David nodded slowly, unconvinced, but trusting the judgment of the man across from him. He didn't have to wait long for the second day to arrive. The second day was worse, not because Bruce was later. He was almost exactly as late as he'd been the first morning. It was worse because of what he said when Ray Carlson knocked on the trailer door at 6:40 a.m. The crew had arrived again in the dark. Same 5:45 call. Same preparation ritual. Coffee consumed standing up. Equipment checked by flashlight. Positions taken before the sun had fully committed to rising. These were people who had chosen this industry knowing exactly what it demanded. Early mornings, physical work, long days that ended when the director was satisfied, and not a minute before. They did it because they loved it. But love has a limit, and that limit begins to show when one person on the call sheet treats the shared sacrifice as optional. At 6 a.m., Bruce's trailer was dark. At 6:20, still dark. At 6:40, Ray knocked. This time the door opened faster, as if Bruce had been awake but simply hadn't moved toward readiness yet. He was holding a cup of tea. He was calm. He looked at Ray with an expression that contained, in Ray's later description, no embarrassment whatsoever. "I know," Bruce said, before Ray could speak. "I need more time this morning." "We've been ready since 6, Ray said carefully. "I understand that." Bruce's voice was even, measured, carrying the particular quiet confidence of someone who has never had to raise their voice to fill a room. "But I can't perform at the level this scene requires without proper preparation. My body needs specific warm-up sequences. My mind needs to arrive at the emotional center of this character before the camera rolls. If I come out before that process is complete, you'll get less than what this film deserves." Ray stood in the doorway for a moment. "Mr. Lee," he said finally, "there are 80 people who've been standing ready for 40 minutes. "And I respect every one of them," Bruce said, "which is exactly why I won't give them a performance that isn't ready." He said it with complete sincerity. That was the most disorienting part, Ray would later tell people. Bruce Lee genuinely believed what he was saying. He wasn't being arrogant in the way of someone who knows they're being difficult and doesn't care. He believed completely and without doubt that his preparation process was a form of respect to the work, to the crew, to the film itself. The door closed quietly. Ray walked back across the set. Clint was already watching him from the director's chair, reading the answer in the way Ray was walking before a single word was spoken. Clint listened to Ray's account of the trailer door conversation without moving. Not a shift in posture, not a change in expression. Just that stillness that people who worked with him learned to read carefully, because it wasn't the stillness of someone who wasn't thinking. It was the stillness of someone who was thinking very precisely and had no interest in performing the thinking for an audience. "What did he say exactly?" Clint asked. Ray repeated Bruce's words as accurately as he could remember them: the preparation process, the emotional center, the level the scene deserved, the respect for the crew embedded inside the decision to make them wait. Clint was quiet for a long moment. "He believes it," Clint said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ray said. "He absolutely believes it." Clint nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when a situation has just clarified itself into something simpler than it appeared. He stood up, looked at the crew assembled and waiting in the early light, and made the same call he'd made the morning before. "Move to scene 12. We'll build the rest of the day around what we can shoot." The crew moved, again, with the same professionalism they'd shown the day before, because that was who they were. But the atmosphere had changed in a way that didn't need words. 2 mornings, same trailer, same delay, same explanation delivered through a closed door. A pattern that everyone on that set could now see clearly, and that everyone understood, meant something beyond simple tardiness. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't a bad morning. This was a philosophy. Bruce emerged at 9:05 that day, 3 hours and 5 minutes after his call time. He was sharp, prepared, physically extraordinary, in the way that made it genuinely difficult to be angry at him while he was actually performing. He hit every mark. He found the emotional truth of the scene on the second take. Clint gave him the same quiet nod. But something had shifted in how the crew watched him, not with hostility, with a careful, measuring attention, the look of people who are trying to reconcile two true things that don't fit comfortably together. He was remarkable at his work, and his work was costing everyone around him something real. That evening, David Feller came to Clint with numbers, budget overages, rescheduling costs, a third scene that would now require a full lighting redesign because the window it had been built around was gone. "Third day tomorrow," David said. "I know," Clint said. "What are you going to do?" Clint picked up the next day's shot list. "I'm going to find out who he is." The third day carried a different weight from the moment it began. The crew felt it arriving at 5:45 a.m., in a way that was hard to name, but impossible to miss. The same jokes that circulated during equipment setup on a normal morning weren't circulating. People spoke in shorter sentences, moved with a deliberateness that looked like focus, but was closer to bracing. 2 mornings of waiting had changed the atmosphere on that set into something that hummed quietly beneath the surface of every professional exchange. This was the day of Bruce's most critical scene in the entire production. A long, dialogue-heavy confrontation that the director of photography had been planning for 2 weeks. It required precise coordination between camera movement and performance, the kind of technical and emotional synchronization that only works when every element arrives at the same moment, fully prepared, with nothing held back. They had one lighting window, 90 minutes, maybe less, depending on cloud movement. After that, the setup was gone, and rebuilding it artificially would cost 3 days, and a budget conversation nobody wanted to have. 83 people were on set by 5:50 a.m. At 6, Bruce's trailer was dark and silent. Nobody said anything. The crew simply held their positions with the patient, slightly exhausted professionalism of people who had already learned what the morning was going to look like before it showed them. At 6:20, Ray Carlson walked toward the trailer. He didn't knock immediately. He stood outside for a moment, a veteran of hundreds of productions, a man who had navigated difficult actors and impossible schedules and every variety of on-set crisis the industry could manufacture. He stood there composing himself the way you compose yourself before a conversation you already know isn't going to go well. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. After a long pause, the door opened. Bruce was holding his tea again. Same bathrobe, same composure, same eyes that were sharp and present in a face that showed no recognition of what 2 mornings of this had cost the people standing behind Ray in the early light. "Mr. Lee," Ray started. "I know what you're going to say," Bruce said quietly, "and I need you to understand something. This scene, today's scene, is the most important work I will do on this production. I cannot bring myself to that place on someone else's schedule. The preparation has to be complete, or the performance will be hollow. Hollow work serves no one." Ray opened his mouth. Behind him, across the set, Clint Eastwood stood up from his director's chair. The crew noticed immediately, all of them, because in 2 days of waiting he hadn't done that once. He was walking toward the trailer. The set went completely silent. Not the gradual quiet of people finishing conversations, the instant total silence of 83 professionals who understood simultaneously that something was happening that none of them had a script for. Cameras stopped being adjusted. Coffee cups stopped moving. Every eye tracked Clint as he crossed the set with the unhurried, deliberate stride of a man who had already decided everything he needed to decide before he took the first step. Ray Carlson stepped back from the trailer door without being asked. Clint stopped in front of it. He looked at Bruce Lee, the tea, the bathrobe, the composed expression of a man who hadn't yet registered that this moment was categorically different from the 2 that had preceded it. He didn't raise his voice. Everyone who was there, in every account ever given of what happened next, agrees on that detail with complete consistency. There was no anger in it, no performance, no theatrical weight dropped onto the words to make them land harder. Just 5 words, spoken in that quiet, unhurried rasp, delivered the way Clint Eastwood delivered everything, as simple, final fact. "You're done here, pack up." Bruce Lee held Clint's gaze for a long moment. The composure was still there, but something behind it had shifted, like a wall that hasn't fallen, but has just registered the impact of something significant hitting it. "You're making a decision," Bruce said carefully, "based on a misunderstanding of what serious work requires." "I understand exactly what happened," Clint said. 3 mornings, 3 hours, 80 people waiting. That's what happened. The performance I would have given you needed to start at 6, Clint said. Same as everyone else here. He didn't move, didn't look away. "There's a car arranged. Someone will help with your things." Bruce set his tea down slowly on the trailer's small side table. The gesture had a finality to it that seemed to surprise even him, as if the physical act of putting the cup down made the moment real in a way the words hadn't quite managed. He looked past Clint at the crew. 83 faces looking back, not with triumph, not with cruelty, with the quiet, level gaze of people who had been waiting in the cold since before sunrise for 3 consecutive mornings and had nothing left to offer the situation except honesty. Bruce Lee looked at those faces for a long moment. Then he stepped back inside the trailer and closed the door, quietly, without slamming it, which somehow in the memory of everyone present made it worse. Clint turned and walked back to his chair. "Scene 9, he said to Ray. "Let's use the light we have." The production van that carried Bruce Lee away from that set reached the highway before the crew had finished repositioning for Scene 9. Nobody watched it go. Not because they didn't notice, because there was work to do, and work was the most honest response available to what had just happened. Clint was already at the monitor reviewing the first setup of the morning with his director of photography, speaking in the low, technical shorthand of 2 people who have worked together long enough to communicate in half sentences. The crew moved with a different energy than it had carried for the previous 2 mornings, not celebratory. Nothing as simple as that. It was closer to the feeling of a room after a long, unresolved tension has finally broken in one direction or the other. A functional relief that didn't require anyone to feel good about how it had arrived. Ray Carlson later described it as the set exhaling. By mid-morning, word had reached the production offices on the studio lot. By early afternoon, it had traveled the particular invisible highway that connects every assistant, every development executive, every agent's office in a 10-mile radius of Hollywood into a single, continuously updated information network. By evening, the story was moving through industry dinners and agency calls and the specific kind of hallway conversations that shaped careers from a distance. Clint Eastwood had dismissed Bruce Lee from a production. 3 late arrivals, 5 words. Done. The details filled in quickly because there were 83 witnesses and film crews, whatever their discretion on other matters, do not keep professional conduct stories to themselves when the story is this clean. Bruce's representation moved fast. His agent released a careful statement about creative differences and scheduling conflicts, the standard architecture of a Hollywood exit that was meant to leave all doors open. But the 83 witnesses were already talking, and what they described didn't resemble creative differences. It resembled something much simpler and much harder to rehabilitate. What struck people most in the retelling wasn't the firing itself. Directors had fired actors before. That wasn't news. What struck people was the mechanism of it. No warning meeting, no formal process, no escalating series of conversations designed to give everyone cover. 3 mornings of observation followed by 5 words, and a car already arranged. The already arranged car was the detail that stayed with people longest. It meant Clint had known before he walked across that set exactly what he was going to do. The walk itself wasn't a decision. It was an announcement. And in Hollywood, the difference between those 2 things is everything. Here is what the story is not about. It is not about Bruce Lee being wrong. A man who had spent a decade fighting for the right to exist on his own terms inside an industry that had tried systematically to reduce him does not become simply wrong because one morning went badly. The preparation philosophy he carried onto that set had been built from real experience, real sacrifice, and a genuine understanding of what serious performance required. None of that disappeared because of what happened in Alberta. And it is not about Clint Eastwood being right in some absolute universal sense. He was right for his set, his crew, his system of working. Another director, with a different philosophy and a more flexible production structure, might have found a way to absorb the delay and extract something extraordinary from the friction. Art has been made that way before. What it is actually about is simpler and harder than either of those things. It is about what happens when two completely coherent philosophies occupy the same space and neither one has room to bend. Bruce Lee's preparation was not performance. It was not laziness, wearing a sophisticated costume. It was a real methodology that had produced real results across a remarkable career. And Clint's discipline was not rigidity for its own sake. It was the operational backbone of a collaborative system that protected 83 people's time, the studio's money, and the film's integrity simultaneously. Both things were true. They just could not coexist. Years later, a journalist asked Clint about the incident in the middle of a longer interview about his directing philosophy. Clint was quiet for a moment, in the way he was always quiet before saying something he'd already thought through completely. "Filmmaking is a collective act," he said finally. "The moment any one person decides their contribution matters more than the collective effort, the whole thing starts to come apart. Doesn't matter how talented that person is. Maybe, especially if they're talented." He didn't mention Bruce Lee by name. He didn't need to. The crew members who were present on all 3 mornings tell the story differently, depending on who's asking and how much time has passed. But they all return to the same moment when they reach the end of it. Not the 5 words, not the van pulling away. The moment just before Clint stood up from his chair, that last second when 83 people were still waiting and the morning light was still moving and everything that was about to happen hadn't happened yet. That moment, they say, lasted much longer than it should have, and everyone on that set knew, before Clint took a single step, exactly how it was going to end. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who understands that real professionalism is its own form of respect. And if you've ever watched talent and discipline collide in a room, tell us what happened in the comments below.